Very good afternoon to all our participants in Israel and Europe. Good morning to those who join us from the United States or from across the Atlantic. It's a pleasure to host again a Minerva colloquium, Corona time Minerva colloquium. This is, I think, the 8th. And our main innovation today that we have a double bill, 2 papers discussing the states of emergency declaration during this Corona crisis and their ramifications. Our first paper was written by Christian Bjelkskov from Aarhus University in Denmark and Professor Stefan Voigt from the University of Hamburg, also a principal investigator at the Minerva Center and the director of the Institute of Law and Economics at the Law Faculty of the University of Hamburg. It's a great pleasure to have you, Stefan, with us, and we'll hear your paper in a second. Our second paper will be given by Kosti from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and I present him before his paper. We'll open for questions, the comments, discussion after the 2 presentations. So Stefan, the floor is yours. Looking forward to your presentation.
Okay. Thanks, Eli. Thanks very much for having me on this webinar. As you just said, it's joint work with Christian Bjelkskov. Unfortunately, he was called into a very important faculty meeting at short notice. So unfortunately, he cannot participate right now, although he very much would have liked to do so. Let me try to motivate a little bit the question, but I guess it's almost unnecessary to do so. As you are all aware, the current pandemic has caused hundreds of thousands to die and millions to lose their jobs. But that's not what we are interested in this small little presentation. We are interested in the fact that some 100 governments have declared a state of emergency due to the pandemic. Actually, the precise number as of today is 99 governments having declared. And declaring a state of emergency often implies that powers are shifted away from the executive to the executive, away from the other 2 branches of government. It also implies a reduction in civil liberties for many citizens of a country. And in this presentation, we are concerned not with the short-term effects, but rather the possible long-term dangers to the rule of law. As the Minerva Center is interested in the rule of law under extreme conditions, it seems to be fitting that we are concerned with possible dangers to the rule of law as a consequence of all these states of emergencies being declared. And I want to give you, as a background, I want to give you some reasons to be suspicious of seeing so many states of emergency being declared. And actually, as part of my work and our work to the Minerva Center, over the last couple of years, Christian and I have looked into a number of questions. We have analyzed the content of emergency provisions. We've looked at the reasons that make governments declare a state of emergency, and we've looked into the effects after a state of emergency has been declared. And here is, in very brief terms, some of our key findings. So firstly, some 90% of all countries have constitutionalized emergency provisions today. That is around 170 countries in the world. And we also refer to these as emergency constitutions for short, although it's not a separate document, of course. Secondly, these are invoked quite frequently. And in this 30-year period between 1985 and 2014, they have been declared at least 137 times on the nation state level. That is not counting districts and counties, etc., just on the nation state level. So that is already quite a bit. Now, regarding the effects, we find some, how should I put it, rather unexpected results. So if we look at natural disasters, and the pandemic is a kind of natural disaster, a biological natural disaster, then if one compares those countries that have declared a state of emergency as a consequence of a natural disaster to those that have not, and one controls for the seriousness of a natural disaster by looking at the number of people that have been affected, then we note that more people die in those countries that have declared a state of emergency. This is an unexpected finding, but it's a worrisome, it's a troubling finding, if you want. Regarding at other, analyzing other kinds of incidents, namely terrorist incidents, we find that declaring a state of emergency does not reduce the number of terrorist incidents that occur later on, but it does reduce the civil rights in a country. So these are all reasons to be a bit suspicious if so many governments declare a state of emergency. And now the question is it all different this time? I mean, you know, this is in a sense, it's the worst pandemic the world has seen for 100 years. So it could be that this time emergencies are being used for proper purposes. And this is actually what we want to look at today. So more precisely, we want to ask two questions. Question number one, what are the factors that make governments declare a state of emergency? And question number two, once it has been declared, what are the effects? What can we say about the effects? I mean, obviously right now we only have trends, but I think it's interesting and it's worth having a look at these trends. Now, just a word sort of from a more or less methodological point of view. I'm an economist, and this might sound cynical to all non-economists, but the current situation is also very interesting, as I'm not aware of any situation before in which so many countries have declared a state of emergency, basically at the same time, more or less at the same time, and due to the same cause. Okay, so this makes the comparison of the factors that lead countries to declare or not to declare fairly easy and straightforward. So in a sense, this is a very interesting situation for people who are interested in analyzing these things econometrically. So let me talk a little bit about potential determinants. What factors might we think might governments lead to declare a state of emergency? And I'm basically giving you four groups of factors. The first one being obviously the state of public health. I mean, the number of people infected, we would expect that the more people are infected, the higher the likelihood that a state of emergency would be declared. Secondly, the quality of the political system. So basically we are asking whether countries that have a high degree of democracy, a high rule of law score, that have realized media freedom, are less likely to declare, because there might be criticism in the public, there might be sort of scrutiny of government behavior, etc. So it might be less attractive for government to declare under these conditions. Thirdly, we also want to take into account the quality of informal institutions, and we do this by looking at the generalized level of trust. And the idea is the following: if most people in a country trust each other, they might also trust that they will behave cooperatively. That is, if social distancing is helpful in slowing down the spread of the disease, they might be doing social distancing. If wearing a mask makes sense, they might be wearing a mask without government having to tell them, okay? So if there is a high degree of trust in a country, it could be that the likelihood that a government declares is somewhat lower than if there is no high level of generalized trust in a country. Thirdly, and here I'm a bit unclear about the likely effect, it could be that the income per capita could play a role. One could argue, well, the higher it is, the easier it is to basically forego a little bit of production. But that's a bit unclear. But the real group that we are really interested in here is the fourth group, namely the attractiveness of calling a state of emergency for the government in place. So what we look at here, and I will be explaining this a little more in a minute, is how difficult it is for government to declare a state of emergency. The idea being the more difficult it is, the lower the likelihood that it will be declared. We will secondly look at what are the benefits for the executive once a state of emergency has been declared. And obviously the hypothesis is the more benefits there are in for a government, the higher the likelihood that it will be declared. And then sort of as a third aspect, we also look at the power to issue executive decrees that the executive has. So if there is broad executive decree powers, the idea would be then, well, it's not so essential to declare a state of emergency. So we just, we have a look at this. If you want, you can think of executive decrees as a possible alternative to declaring a state of emergency. Okay, now let me say 2 or 3 words on this strange terms here, on these strange terms, cost INEP, benefit INEP. So they will be on this slide here. So what we did in previous work is we basically coded all constitutional provisions referring to the difficulty of declaring a state of emergency, and we call this cost INEP, the cost index of emergency powers, as well as the benefits that the executive can draw after it has been declared. We call this benefit INEP. And actually, since the benefit INEP will play some role later on, let me spell this out in a little more detail. So basically we ask, does the government of the day have the power to dissolve parliament after having declared a state of emergency? Okay. We further ask, does it have the capacity to derogate from a number of basic rights? And we then ask, does it have the power to expropriate private property and or censor the media? Okay, so we consider these as benefits to the executive, not necessarily to the citizens, but to the executive, and this is why we call it the benefit INEP. Okay, so this should be enough as sort of motivation to have a look at our analysis here. And this is basically the slide that contains our analysis. So you might say, if you look at the bottom of the page, you might say, wow, what is this? 8,000 something observations and only 150 days. So this is our unit of observation is our country days. So this is a analysis day by day by day, okay? And we're interested in finding out under what conditions a government is likely to declare a state of emergency or not, okay? And the results, I propose that we concentrate on the first column right now, which includes 152 countries. That is quite a few countries that have declared, and also quite a few countries that have not declared a state of emergency, okay? And what we see is that, as expected, higher rule of law levels are connected to a lower probability of declaring a state of emergency, as are higher levels of press freedom, okay? We see that per capita income doesn't really have an effect. The next thing that we see is that the log infected, is the number of people that have been infected by the virus, make governments more likely to declare a state of emergency as expected. But notice that the log days since the start of the pandemic, since the first person infected was discovered, doesn't have any effect. And also it doesn't make any difference whether a person at all was affected, any person at all was infected or not. But then what we are really interested in here is the number, the 6.385, which is highly significant. So what this shows is that the more benefits a government can draw from declaring state of emergency, the higher the likelihood that it will do so. So in other words, what we show here is that the behavior of governments in this disaster is pretty much the same as the governments of the behavior of governments in previous disasters. They look for additional powers, and when the Constitution promises additional powers, they are likely to resort to a state of emergency in order to be able to reap these powers. Maybe 2 or 3 additional observations. Trust, we didn't include that here. We find that high trust democracies are indeed significantly less likely to declare a state of emergency, but this could be a consequence, as many of you will know, the Scandinavian countries do particularly well regarding trust levels, and they make it also particularly difficult, and they also have a long tradition of not declaring a state of emergency. So this might be an artifact of the correlation between Scandinavian countries and high trust. So we didn't include it here. And then I was also talking a little bit about extensive decree powers. So we have a small little index here that we constructed. And basically the idea would be if there are few executive decree powers, but high benefits from declaring a state of emergency, a government would be likely to do so. And on the other hand, if it has broad executive decree powers, but there's little additional powers from declaring a state of emergency, the government would be less likely to do so. And here are the results. We split them into autocracies and democracies. The numbers in the cells are the proportion of countries that have declared divided by the total number of countries in the specific cell. And what you can see is that, yes, indeed, it seems to be the case that states of emergency and declarations of these states and the strength, the breadth of decree powers in a sense can be considered as substitutes, right? We would predict that if we go cell by matrix by matrix here, that the number in the lower left cell is higher than the number in the upper right-hand cell. And this is the case regarding both autocracies and democracies. So again, this shows that both democratic leaders as well as autocratic governments basically follow the incentives as they are laid down in the constitutional rules of a country. Okay, let's now move on. That was the first half of my presentation. Let's move on to look at potential effects. So as I said in the beginning, the rule of law is likely to suffer.
5 minutes?
Pardon?
5 minutes?
5 minutes. Okay, I'll try to be quick. So rule of law, separation of powers, very important for the rule of law. We'd be interested in analyzing parliaments closed, courts closed, or media freedom curtailed. We only have reliable data for media freedom curtailed, so this is why we look at it. Also, media freedom is obviously very important. To be able to criticize government, to talk about the best possible policy measures to be implemented to fight the virus. We know from Amartya Sen that no country that has a free press has ever suffered a huge famine. So media freedom, obviously, for the rule of law as well as pluralistic democracy is necessary. So this is why we look at it. And you've all heard that some countries have prohibited the printing of newspapers because they might spread the virus. Others have introduced the spreading of fake news as a criminal offense. So what we do is we use an index of censorship, which includes a number of categories that you can see on the slide here, and here's what we find. Again, so the left-hand side variable, the dependent variable, the variable that we want to explain are the number of events against journalists. Okay, and what we find is that, well, in democracies, this is less likely to happen. Second row is important here. Under a state of emergency, events against journalists are more likely than if a country has not declared a state of emergency. Then the log days since the start of the pandemic shows that events against journalists are particularly likely in the first days after the pandemic has begun in a particular country. But then again, we find that again the benefit INEP is significant for explaining events against journalists. Now, when my co-author first showed me this result, I said, "Come on! I mean, couldn't it be that we are mixing up different things here, namely events against journalists on the one hand and a new legislation passed? So couldn't it be that events against journalists are particularly likely if a country just passed fresh legislation to make this possible, like this fake news spread. Actually, if you look at this matrix here, that doesn't seem to be the case. So there we have 27 incidents where there was an event against a journalist, but no prior change of legislation. And then there were 7 other cases where there were events against journalists, and there was a change in the legislation, but only after the events had occurred. So the message basically is, it doesn't really matter if there is any new legislation against journalists or not. But what matters, and that's my last slide here, or my last line on message on this slide, if we only look at the number of journalists arrested, that's one particular category, and we only look at autocracies, what we see is that those autocrats that that work under a constitution with low benefits, in only every 6th autocracy are there arrests against journalists, whereas those with a high benefit INEP, more than half of all these autocracies have arrested journalists. So again, we seem to find that that emergency constitutions do matter, and they also matter under autocratic regimes. So let me be very brief in my concluding remarks. I started with a question whether this time is different, and sadly the answer is no, this time is not different. The decision to declare a state of emergency can still be explained with political economy considerations, and I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Very interesting stuff, and I think there are a lot of questions and comments, but we'll hear Nir Kosti first and then conduct the discussion. So I'm very happy to have with us today Nir Kosti from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, writing a PhD in political science. He is researching in these passing days the same topic of emergency declaration. Nir, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I will just share my screen. Okay, I'm really glad to be here today, and I would like to thank Stefan for his excellent presentation and for the collaboration today. In a way, my interests in discretionary powers or delegation of authorities in my PhD research led me to this ongoing project on policies under a state of emergency. It's a work in progress, and the crisis is still ongoing, and so the focus of this research, its insights, and basically the answer for most of the questions I will raise. I would like before to thank also Michal, Eli, and Ido for inviting me and for organizing this event. Okay. So as we learned in the previous talk, during March and April, almost 100 countries declared a state of emergency in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we also know that under a state of emergency, governments are empowered to promote policies that they are usually unable to impose. And my question is whether they use these powers once they declare a state of emergency. So my focus here is on policy change under a state of emergency with regard to the application of stringent measures, such as closing schools, closing workplaces, and so forth. Now, it's still not a policy change as we often understand it in the literature, public policy, dealing with policy change or policy accumulation. This might have a lot to do with government's responses to the current crisis when thinking, for example, on policy learning or policy diffusion. Even a state of emergency declaration might be related to how countries imitate and learn from each other. More countries under a state of emergency, for example, makes it easier for other governments to follow, as it may perceive more legitimate move. But when thinking of other fundamental theories like path dependency or punctuated equilibrium, it seems that we have here a different stand of view, as these closing measures are temporal and probably will end at some point. So regarding the literature, and they found it interesting that the research on state of emergency declaration is quite scarce, but thanks to Stefan and to Christian and their work in the last couple of years, we know much more. However, as far as we know more, there are still some knowledge gaps on some aspects of state of emergency. So Stefan already mentioned the work in the last couple of years, the research on comparative emergency constitutions, the factors that lead to declarations of state of emergency, and the consequences of a state of emergency declarations in the field of deregulation of human rights, democratic decline, or whether it is effective or not in mitigating its objectives. I rather focus on policy change and state of emergency. I'm less interested in how effectively governments respond under a state of emergency, but on how state of emergencies are connected to actual policy taken. Well, if state of emergency enable governments the power to impose policies that they are usually unable to make, do they actually use these powers? And if so, in which direction? So the COVID-19 pandemic has allowed us, as Stefan mentioned, to compare countries under a state of emergency more or less at the same time frame, and thus to control some possible explanations or variables. In general, when thinking of state responses to the coronavirus pandemic, more broadly, we can think of three major groups of responses. So closure measures, economic and public health measures, and I will focus again mostly on closure measures, used basically to maintain physical distance between people by canceling public events, closing schools, and so forth. And the basic assumption here is that the state of emergency and policy responses are or should intertwine. When thinking on the relationship between a state of emergency declaration and policy change, we may think of different combinations along two categories. Thinking about this combination, and the two categories are whether a state of emergency was called and whether a policy was changed. And thinking about this combination as a process rather than as a static observation, we may observe it clockwise, and let me now introduce it. So we may assume that under a threat, or be it endogenous or exogenous, two options are possible. A first possibility is a relatively quick declaration of a state of emergency, which is then followed by a more rapid change in policy. In this regard, the declaration may foster a change in policy. And take, for example, Lithuania, that as far as I know was the second European country that declared a state of emergency on February 26th, much before it diagnosed any cases of the coronavirus. And later it allowed the government the power to implement and shape policies. But we also know that the ability to declare a state of emergency is relied on certain factors, and so it might take some time to declare a state of emergency in light of a threat. In a way, it might be a two-phase step. First, policy changes, but not state of emergency, but then the declaration and a continuous policy change. And then when thinking of how policy measures are relieved with regard to state of emergency, it might be again a two-phases process. First, to ease the restrictions, and then a state of emergency ends or not extended. And it might also go the other way around. Firstly, an end of the declaration of the state of emergency, while only afterwards we might see more relief. So this is another option, and basically I'm interested in following this cycle, but as the coronavirus pandemic is an ongoing event, I will try to be more focused on the variance across countries with regard to the declaration and then to the policy change. So the data I use come from two sources. The first is a data set that I created, similar to what I assume Stefan presented, with the help of several colleagues and large coverage of news and media resources. The data set contains basically the data on state of emergency declarations in this period of time. And for policy responses, I used the data of the CGRT project, which created a tool that tracks and compares policy responses to the coronavirus of 151 governments. And as I mentioned, I focus specifically on closure indicators. And you can see here the list of the different indicators. And each indicator, as you can see, is an ordinal scale containing 3 to 5 values. Together, we can, or the OXCGRT project basically aggregate those measures and reported for each of the countries on a daily basis the stringency measure. As you can see, each ordinal measure is rescaled here by its maximum value to create a score between 0 and 100, with missing value contributing to 0. Then these scores are averaged to the index, and I must note before that I aim to refine this indicator and basically to look exactly on some aspects of the measure. And my focus here is on the idea that since countries did not declare a state of emergency at the same time point, I'm focusing on an equal period of time before and after a state of emergency was declared for most of the countries that declared a state of emergency. And I took arbitrary period of time of 15 days before and 15 days after a state of emergency was declared to see how policy responses were changed altogether along this 30 days period. And then I'm looking at how stringent were policies during these two periods. Overall, the data I have provides an observation of 72 countries, and I assume that more countries will appear here in the future as the data collection goes on. So first, let's see the level of policy change before and after a state of emergency was declared. For each country, I calculated the standard deviation of the stringency index 15 days before a state of emergency was declared and 15 days after it was declared. So each box plot presents the concentration of the standard deviation values for each country in the two periods. And we can see here clearly that policy changes were prevalent in both periods, but they also vary. In fact, most restrictive policy were in place before a state of emergency was called, then afterwards. Now this figure provides a more detailed observation of the 72 countries, and for each country, the x-axis provides or presents the number of days before and after a state of emergency was declared. The red line is the day of the declaration. Y-axis presents the stringency measure and range from 0 to 100. The higher the measure, the more stringent a policy is. And we see here that countries vary on several features, but mostly on two. First, the level of restrictiveness at the time of the declaration. So some countries were quite more stringent at this point. And second, the level of changes before and after a state of emergency was made, which of course related to the question of when the state of emergency was called. And we can see here a more detailed overview of 6 countries. In each of these countries, a state of emergency is different in what governments can actually do. For example, in Japan, the government is not allowed to impose lockdown under a state of emergency. But I would like to draw your attention to France and the US that are among the countries which are mostly affected. And in France, the state of medical emergency did not lead to any change in the level of restrictiveness. In the US it did, but the US, and I'm looking here on the federal level, is relatively low in the overall level of restrictiveness when compared to other countries. And we can see also, again, that Japan declared a state of emergency in April relatively late when compared to other countries, but it did not change much its closure policies afterward. And Bolivia and Jordan provide similar illustration of state of emergency and how it may foster more restrictiveness. And this graph clusters the countries based on or to 5 different clusters according to the level of change in the stringency policy before and after a state of emergency was called. I used here k-means mostly for exploratory reasons. And basically the X and Y axis here allow us to see how countries are compared to another in the level of policy change 15 days before and 15 days after a state of emergency was called. And the first group in yellow, this group contains mostly countries that after the declaration was called, imposed more restriction than before. It mostly comprised of countries that were not affected by the coronavirus. Some of them are dictatorships and some presidential democracies, and relatively not free democracies. So for them, it might be less costly to declare a state of emergency. And the second group in red also contains more dictatorships and other not freely democracies. The group here used stringency. This group used stringency policies much earlier, before a state of emergency was declared, and they did not have a lot, or they didn't change much afterwards. And these countries might have perhaps other legal bases for action, or relatively large powers that are already invested in the executive. The third group in blue also, so most policies or most restrictions were already done before a state of emergency was declared, but they show lower levels of stringency in their policies. So this group is a relatively higher in the level of infections, and we discussed whether the use of state of emergency declaration was used here to provide more measures to these governments, maybe in confronting the coronavirus, or maybe it was just used as a blame avoidance strategy. The fourth group here in pink contains countries that also impose restrictions before the declaration, but relatively lower in the level of stringency. Many countries in this group were mostly affected or not affected at all. And the group in green also shows a more, maybe a balanced policy change before and after a state of emergency was called. So the findings clearly show that many countries have restricted the physical or the physical distance or the movement and took some closure measures much longer before a state of emergency was declared, and also as a consequence, the powers used after a state of emergency was called very significantly, but countries basically took more measure, did not took more measures, but used probably what they had at this point. So recalling this figure, most of the countries perform this process. Also, they vary when they approach a state of emergency in light of the level of restrictiveness. And to conclude, under a state of emergency, governments are empowered to promote policies that they are basically not unable to impose. But we saw, however, that the relationship between a state of emergency and policy action is not as clear-cut as we may expected. It might be important in the future to decode the stringency index and to distinguish between policy recommendations and legal restrictions where possible, and also to provide a better image of the components that were changed before and after a state of emergency was declared. In overall, countries started with limiting gathering, closing schools, banning international travels and canceling public events. And later they moved to closing or reducing public transportation services, internal movement, and closing workplaces. So when thinking of possible explanation, we may think of course, the institutional limitation on declaring a state of emergency, but also on the different legal bases countries have to respond. For example, we can think of existing laws that grant authorities under several conditions And we may assume that as long as it's more difficult to declare a state of emergency, countries already used before some closure measures. We may also think on the political cost of declaring a state of emergency. The use of restrictive policy may foster the understanding that this is an emergency situation and a state of emergency should be called. And also the question is what are the functions of such declarations? Maybe maybe to use some fiscal measures and not necessarily closing measures, as we know that this crisis is not only, it's both a health and economic crisis, and also maybe the use of state of declaration, state of emergency was used to any kind of blame avoidance strategies of political leaders after their country being affected by the coronavirus pandemic. So I'll finish here. Thank you very much, and I will appreciate your comments and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nir. It was really a very good complimentary paper, and the view from political science is a little bit different from the view of the economists. If you want to comment or ask a question, please let me know by raising hand or writing in the Q&A. And I see that Tom Ginsburg from Chicago, who has to leave very shortly, wanted to make a comment. So Tom, the floor is yours.
Oh, now I've been muted. Ellie, can you hear me? Yes, okay, great. Wonderful, those were wonderful presentations. I just wanted to kind of make a comment on Nir's finding, which I think is consistent with what we suspect in regard to states of emergency. To me, and this is where my work is going on this topic, it touches on this old debate about the rule of law. Can the rule of law in advance specify all the conditions or all the steps that are going to have to be taken? And I think what Nir is showing us is that no, that Eric Posner and Vermeulen were somewhat right, that the rule of law runs out and you just have to act quickly, and then sort of ex post justification comes in. At the same time, I take from Stefan's paper that doesn't mean that the rule of law is useless, which is also what Posner and Vermeulen say, because Stefan is showing us that these constraints really do operate effectively in sometimes surprising settings. So I just learned a lot. I thought it was a wonderful set of presentations. That's not a question, it's just my brief comment.
Thank you, Tom. Stefan, do you want to react to Nir and to Tom? And then we have Nir react, and then we have further questions.
Sure, I can try to do so. So first of all, thanks very much for your presentation, Nir. It was very interesting. Thanks also, Tom, for your comment. Since Tom is in, I should definitely add that our coding of both the benefit INEP and the cost INEP was done on the basis of Tom's data. Also, what I sort of presented in passing, this strength of executive decree powers is based on Tom's data. So obviously, Tom, you've been very important in this, and sorry I didn't mention you and your work before. Yeah, I think the findings are interesting, but as Tom was already alluding to, in a sense, they are not really contradicting each other, right? Because I mean, if I understand Nir's approach correctly, he's more interested sort of in the short-term policy choices, and the question whether the short-term policy choices are channeled, influenced by having a state of emergency or not. And I think that the finding is really interesting. Having said that, I think it's worth pointing out that we are interested in a different question. I mean, our question is, to what degree is the rule of law likely to suffer from declarations of states of emergency? and you know, I sort of feel like a preacher or a missionary today. We all need to be careful that not too much of the rule of law is being taken away from us as a consequence of power maximizing governments trying to do exactly that. And in that sense, I don't agree. I don't want to go into the details here, but in that sense, I don't agree with Posner and Vermeulen. Basically, the question there was, you know, and that gets us back to Carl Schmitt and you know, this very old discussion. To what degree is it possible to pin down the competences and the restrictions that we want the government to be subject to under a state of emergency, given that we are acting in a situation of uncertainty that cannot be predicted with any degree of certainty. We simply do not know what kinds of emergency we will be confronted with tomorrow. But having said that, it seems that firstly that emergency constitutions do have an important role. They do channel government behavior, and those that give governments more power do not necessarily lead to any better results. So I don't see any convincing argument why we should basically constrain the rule of law further, or why we should give up parts of the rule of law because there is such an overwhelming pandemic. Countries that haven't declared do not necessarily do worse than countries that have declared.
Thank you. Maybe I'll add another angle because Nir's point of view is a political scientist and you're an economist and mine is a lawyer. Nir, when you say that state of emergency usually followed and not preceded changes of policies, the question arises, by what means the changes of policy took place before the state of emergency? And this is an interesting question which is connected to the decree discussion of Stefan. If you have an alternative measures, you may utilize them, and then the state of emergency really gives a stamp but doesn't really change the actual measures that you take in order to fight the catastrophe or the extreme condition. But of course, their implication is derogation of human rights or violation of human rights. And it's interesting, you know, Israel is not part of the survey at all because we have a permanent state of emergency from the establishment of the state. But in a sense, your story applies also to Israel because in the first months of the crisis, there was no utilization of emergency regulation on the basis of emergency declaration, but some decrees of the Ministry of Health. The policy really didn't change when the usage transferred to emergency regulations. The government discovered that it has this power to issue emergency regulations, but this really didn't change the policy with regard to the catastrophe. I don't know with regard to Israel, it did actually change the situation with regard to human rights, because the first emergency regulation were the Secret Service authorization to monitor all the cellular phones in order to report on infected and connection with infected people. So this actually supports both papers. Okay, that one thing is very important to look at the alternatives to emergency regulation and what can be done on the basis of emergency declaration, as opposed to other legal means. And that emergency regulation, and this falls into place with previous finding of Stefan and Christian, that emergency regulation not only does not help to fight the catastrophe, but actually brings to worse consequences. This is, of course, also a question of preparation. If you are not prepared to a catastrophe, and usually there is a correlation between less developed countries, less democratic countries, less rule of law countries, and countries who are not really well prepared for catastrophes, then these countries declare state of emergency, but the outcomes are worse, not because of the legal means or the policy changes, but because of lack of preparation and thinking about how to confront this state of emergency. So this is my 2-cent contribution. Nir, Stefan, if you want to respond, and then we give the floor to Gadi.
Yes, thank you, Ali, and thank you also. I would like to also thank to Tom and to Stefan, and I think that you mentioned a really good point. And if thinking or considering existing measures or existing laws that countries have, I think that if then a state of emergency is less related to actual policies or maybe to the effectiveness of policy responses, then it goes back to the question that Stefan raised, which is why is it used for? Why do governments declare a state of emergency? And I think that the picture will be also the picture will also be clearer as time goes on. I think that it might be interesting to see when countries will end the state of emergency situation. It has already ended in some countries, I think around 10 countries, but I think that the question of its functionality will be much more clearer as long as we goes on in time, and basically we would be able to understand how it is linked to actual responses or how not, and how these declarations were used for maybe used or misused by kind of different governments.
Stefan?
I suggest we might collect more questions if there are more.
Okay, Gadi.
Okay, thanks. First of all, thanks very much. Two very, very engaging papers. And actually, I would like to open with Stefan's comment at the beginning of his lecture, which I found to be a very insightful comment, which can lead to different directions. So Stefan said that never in history, probably after 1945, so many countries quite simultaneously were activating emergency legislation, and it also in a way justifies a near project. However, I would like to have two quick comments. One comment, I would like to be a bit more suspicious of the suspicion regarding emergency regulations in the time of the pandemic. And I think that, like Ellie suggested, or maybe Nir, we have to begin with the policy-making issue. You know, most liberal societies and most countries, however the political system would be, have been taken by surprise. It was to most virologists an unknown virus transmitted to human beings. Most health policies were ill-equipped to deal with such a pandemic. And it seems to me that we have on this backdrop, before we are doing a legal analysis, to, in a way, to differentiate between three types of emergency regulations, right? At the level of very basic typology. Firstly, cases in which we say, well, you know, a populist leader, let's say Trump or Netanyahu, have used or manipulated a crisis in order to propel political interests. Okay, so this would be one type of case studies. The other type would be cases in which I wonder whether it could have been done without emergency legislation at some level. And there are different legal level of emergency regulations. It can be primary legislation, secondary legislation, all kind of legal creations of emergencies, but let's take closures or tracking carriers of corona, of COVID-19. Maybe in some cases, governments ill-equipped to deal with the pandemic were left with no other choice but to use emergency legislation. And the third types, I would say, are borderline cases. So one case, for example, would be tracking our mobile phones. So it's certainly abuse of privacy, but it's a matter for discussion which alternatives existed. So I think that we have to do a more fine-tuning of our intuitive criticism of emergency legislation in non-authoritarian systems. Second comment, I think that judicial review should be part of the picture. I mean, there is a difference between countries with an active, effective judicial review and countries which have only very fragile type of judicial review. But again, those are very brief comments, and I enjoyed the papers very much. So thanks very much, Stefan and Nir.
Thank you, Gadi. We have another question from Sharon Yadin, who asked Stefan how the rule of law is measured, and you could say a few words on this.
Okay, can I come in?
Sure.
Okay, so maybe first to Gadi's comment and then the measurement question. In essence, I don't think we disagree, to be honest, Gadi, because I was trying to be very careful in saying that we are explicitly not evaluating and judging the short-term policy measures, because we don't know whether whatever social distancing, quarantine, shutdown, lockdown, etc., is necessary or is effective or is useful. We don't know, and they might be necessary. But since we don't know, we don't want to offer any judgment on that. And the second reason I was trying to offer for not dealing with this issue is that different societies might sort of choose different trade-offs. Assume there's a trade-off between saving the maximum number of lives on the one hand, and reopening or opening up again society as a whole. Let's focus on economic consequences. Okay, so in a sense, there could be a trade-off between saving additional lives versus producing more goods. Okay, and different societies might sort of make different decisions here, and it's not my job, it's not our job to evaluate these decisions. Very brutally speaking, one could say in one society, the statistical value of a life is X, and in another society, it's 2X. Well, it's not me to judge that, okay? So what we were interested in, or let me start differently. So we started from the assumption that we want to basically stick to the rule of law, at least in the medium and long term. So it's in a sense, it's starting with the assumption that the rule of law is essential for a number of things that we want society to be like. Okay, so the question is, and that's why we proposed to look at the separation of powers. And it could be that parliaments are being closed because executives don't like critical lawmakers. It could be that, we get closer to the second part of your question, it could be that courts are being closed to make judicial review of some of the decisions of the current government place more difficult or even impossible, okay? So this is why we would like to look at parliamentary closures on the one hand and closures of courts on the other. We are working on that, but it's not as easy as just counting the number of emergencies. And coding decisions, you know, closing some courts, prioritizing some cases over other cases, you know, liberalizing deadlines, etc. So there are many aspects that basically need to be taken into account regarding parliamentary closures. Was the closure decided by parliament or was it decided by the executive? The same question could be asked with regard to courts. So in other words, we feel our data is not reliable enough to really enter into this question. But, you know, from a rule of law, whatever liberal democracy point of view, we want a critical press. We want a critical press, even if very far-reaching measures are necessary. We want the press to be able to discuss whether they make sense, whether they are proportional, or whether they are serving their declared purposes. Okay, so this is why I think there is a good reason. It's not only statistical data availability, but I think there's also a very good reason. Liberal democracy, pluralist democracy will only survive if there is pluralist positions, and if pluralist positions can be openly discussed. So in essence, free press, media freedom is a crucial, as a precondition for having both democracy and the rule of law. And that's why we look at those things. And to be honest with you, I mean, if you look at some of the stories that we're hearing regarding the introduction of fake news, the spreading of fake news as a criminal offense from countries such as Hungary or Russia, then the work of journalists has been made very, very, you know, much more difficult than it already has been. And this is why we look at that. And I believe you can have, you know, quarantine and distancing and tracking, but you don't necessarily need to reduce the freedom of the press. And that's why we are focusing exactly on the freedom of the press. So we are interested really in the, I said this is, it looks like a trend. So we are looking at possible long-term trends that might go beyond the current pandemic. Because the hunch is that, you know, criminalizing the spreading of fake news will not stop once the pandemic is over, but in all likelihood will be contained, will be remaining after the spread of the disease, and that's why we're focusing on that. Just to end with sort of a more on a more positive note, I think there's also some encouraging examples for judicial review, where when you look at some of the Latin American courts, that, you know, when you look at whatever Colombia or Ecuador, where the courts have said, okay, until tomorrow morning, you explain me why this and that decree is needed. Otherwise, I declare it as not in compliance with the Constitution. So there are also some encouraging signs for how seriously some of the constitutional courts take their role as doing judicial review. Just a second on the data question. To be honest with you, and this is a bit embarrassing, I do not really know which indicator we have used, but there is various indicators on offer. So there's the worldwide governance indicators that has a rule of law component. There's varieties of democracy indicators that have a rule of law component. Together with a co-author, Goodman, I have my own rule of law index. So there's various of these indicators around.
Thank you, Stefan. You mentioned Latin America, and we have a question from Carolina Gonzalez Rodriguez from Argentina. Please.
Can you hear me? Hi.
Yes, we can hear
you. Hello, good morning, and thank you very much, Professor Stefan and Professor Kosti and Minerva, for this opportunity. Yes, you already mentioned, and you've been talking about judicial review, Professor Stefan, and I believe that in the short-term incentives for politicians in Buchanan, Tulloch, and the School of Public Choice terms, and those are highly enhanced by SOE's regulations. Like we can see that in Argentina particularly. And I wonder, what's your perspective on the efficiency of judicial review of said rulings in poor institutional settings countries such as mine, particularly after the emergency is over.
You want me to come in Ellie, or?
Sure.
Actually, so you are a lot closer to the action than I am there. But thanks for your question. I think it's a bit early to make a judgment regarding the efficiency of judicial review with regard to this particular instance. But you might be aware that there is a literature that has looked into how constraining ex-post judicial review has been under previous states of emergency. So Deisenhaus, I believe in the 2006 book, is very critical with regard to that. Bruce Ackerman has looked into this, and he's also very critical with regard to that. So in a sense, the record that we have with regard to judicial review is not very encouraging, but from what I've seen so far with regard to some of the Latin American courts, we might hopefully we might have reason to be a little more optimistic.
Thank you, Stefan. And may I ask or make a comment that will actually refer the floor to Nir. One can distinguish between three groups of countries with regard to the actual policy towards the corona. There are the countries, mostly European countries, Israel included, that had the very tough lockdowns, tough changes of normal life at the expense of the economy. There are countries that either implicitly or explicitly gave more weight to economic considerations or took a different theory of the herd immunity and did not impose very stringent measures and closures of the economy. UK in the beginning, Sweden, Holland, maybe the US with a turnaround, Brazil. And we had a third group of countries, mostly East Asian countries, not China, but countries in East Asia which confronted the SARS and the MARS epidemic and were much better prepared, who did not really had the general lockdowns like us, had a very, very focused local treatment of infection areas, and disruption to the general economic life was softer than in the first group of countries. And I wonder if this categorization that is based on initial categorization of policies have a reflection in state of emergency declarations, because this can be another proof to what Stefan is arguing and has been arguing in previous articles as well, that basically the declaration of state of emergency, the main function is to increase the powers of the current political regime and not to have real means to fight some kind of a catastrophe or emergency. And in terms of consequences, there is no correlation between declaration of state of emergency and better consequences vis-a-vis the catastrophe. So I wonder if this categorization actually correspond to the map that you showed before, which was very difficult to interpret and to look carefully via Zoom. And Stefan later on might remark on what general ramification this observation can suggest us.
Okay, thank you, Eli, for your question. And I think that it also relates to Gadi's first point on the platform and the content. So in a way, I think that my assumption was that there, and it's a bit naive, that there is or there should be a sort of connection between them. So in a way, what we see, when we see what kind of measures, when we look on how governments responded to the coronavirus pandemic, we need to think, or we need to see actually what kinds of authorities they use, whether they use it out of declarations out of the state of emergency declaration, whether they use it by existing law, or whether they actually use some voluntary recommendations. And to answer your questions, you mentioned 3 groups of countries: the tough lockdown, the herd immunities, and East Asia countries. And I'm not sure exactly which of them declared or not declared a state of emergency. My hint is that most of the governments that did impose some tough lockdowns did declare a state of emergency. But regarding the herd immunity, if we take Sweden or the UK, both took a very different policy responses when we think of the content of them, and also different platforms. So in Sweden, the constitution does not provide basically the opportunity to declare a state of emergency if it's not a war. And in the UK, the government have some existing laws, and also introduce some new legislation, new emergency legislations that provide some more additional and extensive authorities to the government. And regarding the East Asia countries, I would be interested to go into it more deeply and to understand exactly what happened there. I know that in China, for example, there is no such opportunity to declare a state of emergency, but they actually introduced a new legislation that provided the government to impose those local lockdowns, as you mentioned. So in a way, it is and again, it goes back to the question of the platform and the content. And I think that the connection between them is not very clear, and this goes back to also to the findings that Stefan illustrated, and his and Christian research more broadly. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
more research has to be conducted.
Yeah.
Stefan, before I give you the last words, because we are actually drawing to the conclusion time, there is a question from Raji Kumar from India. How do we look at India's effort to tackle the corona epidemic? I'm not sure if we are qualified to answer, but the floor is yours for a short concluding words.
Okay, so I can start. I'm not an expert of Indian politics, but India did not declare a state of emergency. Although India, when I looked, for example, on how stringent were policies in India, so it basically it is fully the policies are fully stringent. So in a way, India and the research that I presented here did not really distinguish between countries that did declare a state of emergency and countries that did not declare a state of emergency. But when we think, or when we look on how policy responses were basically differed or compared to each of this group, we see that there is no, that basically it's, the question, the answer is not really easy. And it goes back also, it goes back to those additional inquiring or additional investigation that should be basically conducted.
Thank you, Stefan.
Yeah, I didn't really hear the question from India, and I'm obviously not an expert on India, but I think the Indian case sort of also contains a very interesting question with regard to federalism. And we have Brazil, we have Argentina, we have somebody from Argentina present. So I think it's a very interesting case in the sense that you have what is it, 27, 28 states and you know, similar entities in India, and you have the overall federal government, and it's actually very interesting to see who can do what, and I think this might also be interesting for the theory of federalism beyond the case. Just remember the statements by Donald Trump that he has sort of unlimited powers and he can tell the governors whatever they are supposed to do or not supposed to do. So it's an interesting case study also with regard to the relationship between the federal government and the state governments. And actually, I'm obviously also from a country with a federal structure, and I'm a bit amazed how sort of critically federalism is being seen these days, because I believe that federalism basically gives us the opportunity to react to the virus in more nuanced ways. I mean, we have a state in Germany in the northeast, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, where we basically do not have any infections. So it might be a good idea to have a different policy there than in the south, in Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg, where the proportion of people who are infected are a lot higher. So I think it's also, you know, there could also be interesting lessons in it for federalism versus unitary state organization, if you want. Finally, to conclude, and you know, to have some reaction to you, Ellie, on Nir's presentation, I think it's a fascinating result. I really would like to see the slides. So if you can send the slides, and I really would like to look at the various groups in a little more detail, in doing exactly what Ellie proposes to do. Actually, I can tell you just one additional bit. We also did look at the fiscal measures that are being offered by the data set that you quoted. And the question there was, well, you know, it could be interesting if the constitutional emergency provisions of a country allow the government to basically spend a lot more or reallocate important budget positions according to their own will, then this might be another reason for governments to declare a state of emergency, you know, because they're not constrained by parliament anymore, who are supposed to be the deciding on the budget. And actually, what we find there is that the only relevant driver of the proportion of fiscal measures over the GDP of a country really is the per capita income of the country. So there we do not see a very close correlation between any of the constitutional emergency provisions, but it's just that, you know, if you're rich, you're spending more on emergency measures than if you are poor, at least according to the data from the Oxford data set that you quoted. Also, you know, taken with a grain of salt, because I don't really know how reliable the data are, and obviously they change every single day. But we looked at it about a week ago, and the only significant correlation that we could find was between how wealthy a country is and the fiscal measures that have been passed.
Very interesting. You know, the question of the function of federation during crisis or emergency is a very interesting question, which we should actually discuss in a different meeting and maybe conduct research about. But there is also a connection, because there is an interesting question whether federations tend to declare state of emergency more or less, or the percentage of countries who are federations are equally or not equally represented among those who declared emergency, and try to explain that. But these are food for thoughts, because our time is up. I want to really thanks again. Excellent, fascinating papers and discussion, Stefan, Nir. And I want also to thank Ido and Michal for coordinating all the technicalities for this lecture and previous lectures, and we'll meet in our next webinar very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thanks
very
for
much,
everybody.
Thank you very much.
Stay safe and healthy.